The coach wheels had barely stopped turning when Thomas Ashworth, 9th Duke of Ashridge, threw open the door himself, ignoring the footman's outstretched hand. 4 years. 4 years of drawing rooms in Vienna, of treaties signed in languages that were not his own, of letters from home growing thinner and more distant with every passing season. He had dreamed of this return 100 times, the warm glow of the hall fires, his grandmother's papery hands cupping his face, the old butler Wren fussing over his travelling coat. He had not dreamed of this. The manor rose before him through a curtain of autumn drizzle, grey stone slick and unwelcoming, its windows dark despite the hour. No lanterns had been lit along the drive, no one waited on the steps. Even the ivy seemed to have grown wild and untended, clawing at the mullioned windows like something trying to escape. "Strange," he murmured, and swung his greatcoat over his shoulder as he strode up the worn stone steps 2 at a time. Inside, the entrance hall smelled of damp and tallow smoke rather than beeswax and lavender, the way his mother had always kept it. The portraits of his ancestors watched him from the shadows, their painted eyes following him as he crossed the flagstones, spurs ringing. He heard the voices before he reached the parlour. "You will tell me where you have hidden it, girl, or so help me." Thomas stopped just short of the doorway, one gloved hand resting against the cold stone frame. Inside, his uncle, Lord Richard Ashworth, stood over a young woman near the hearth, his fingers wrapped tight around her thin wrist, twisting it behind her back at an angle that made Thomas's own arm ache in sympathy. The girl's linen cap had slipped, loosing a few strands of chestnut hair across her cheek, and though her face was turned half away, Thomas could see the tight, colourless set of her mouth, the look of someone enduring pain rather than someone about to give in to it. "I have searched every corner of this house," Richard hissed, close to her ear. "The key did not simply vanish, Hannah. You were the last soul in his study before he died. Where is it?" The girl said nothing. Richard's grip tightened. Her sleeve slid back an inch, and even from the doorway, in the low firelight, Thomas saw them. The bruises. Not one mark, but several, blooming dark blue and yellow-green beneath the fine bones of her wrist, layered atop each other as though this were not the first time his uncle's hand had closed around her that way. Something in Thomas's chest turned to iron. He had faced down Austrian ministers who thought a young diplomat easy prey. He had stood his ground in rooms thick with men twice his age and 3 times as cunning. But nothing in 4 years abroad had prepared him for the particular, quiet fury of watching a member of his own family lay hands on a servant girl in his father's house. His boots struck the flagstones as he stepped through the doorway, and the riding crop still looped about his wrist snapped once, sharply, against the leather of his boot, a sound like a pistol shot in the hush of the room. Both heads turned. "Uncle," Thomas said, and his voice, when it came, was low and even, and far more dangerous for its calm. "Release her wrist." Richard's eyes widened for the briefest moment, shock, quickly smoothed into something colder. "Thomas, you might have sent word you were coming. Release her wrist," Thomas said again, "or I shall consider it a personal insult, and you may explain yourself to me instead of to her." Slowly, deliberately, Richard let go. The girl's arm dropped to her side, and she cradled it against her apron without a sound, not a gasp of relief, not a word of thanks, nothing at all. She simply stood, eyes lowered, as still as one of the marble statues in the long gallery. Thomas crossed the room, his gaze moving from his uncle's face to the girl's bandaged wrist and back again. Behind him, in the doorway, he was dimly aware of 2 housemaids frozen mid-step with a laden tea tray between them, neither daring to breathe, let alone move. He stopped before Hannah. Up close, she was younger than he had first thought, perhaps 19, with a fine, serious face and eyes the colour of strong tea, fixed somewhere near his top button rather than meeting his own. "He hurt you?" Thomas asked her directly, gently, as though his uncle were not standing 3 feet away listening to every word. The room seemed to hold its breath. Hannah did not cry out. She did not accuse. She did not even nod. She said nothing at all, not one word, not one sound, and somehow her silence was louder than any scream could have been. It stretched through the parlour like a held note, thinning the very air, until even the coals in the grate seemed to burn colder for it. Thomas felt the chill of it settle over his skin like frost. "Uncle," he said quietly, not taking his eyes from the girl's bowed head. "You will leave this room. Now." And in the tense hush that followed, as Lord Richard's footsteps retreated across the flagstones, Thomas found himself wondering, with a strange, unshakable certainty, exactly what kind of silence this was. The silence of a frightened girl, or the silence of someone guarding a secret far larger than a stolen key. Rain found every loose pane in Ashridge Manor that night, tapping and worrying at the glass like something trying to be let in. Thomas climbed the west staircase alone, a single candle throwing his shadow tall against the panelling, and thought of how many times he had run up these same steps as a boy, always racing toward his grandmother's rooms, always certain of a warm welcome at the top. He knocked softly and let himself in without waiting for an answer. The Dowager Duchess Eleanor sat propped against a bank of pillows, her white hair loose about her shoulders, a shawl of Belgian lace drawn over her nightgown. The room smelled of lavender water and the sharp, medicinal tang of tonic, and a low fire crackled in the grate, casting long, shivering shadows across the ceiling beams. "Grandmother," Thomas said, crossing to her bedside. Her pale eyes drifted toward him, unfocused for a long moment before recognition crept in. "Thomas, is it truly you, my boy? They told me you were still in Vienna." "I came as soon as I could." He took her thin hand between both of his own, careful of the fragile bones beneath the skin. "I am sorry I was not here sooner." She patted his fingers absently, her attention already wandering toward the hearth, where a young woman knelt mending a torn lace shawl by the firelight. Thomas recognized the bowed head, the careful, unhurried stitches. Hannah. "She keeps me steady," Eleanor murmured. "Better than any physician they've sent up from London. Hannah, dear, fetch my drops, won't you?" Hannah rose without a word and crossed to the little table by the washstand, where a brown glass bottle sat beside a silver spoon. She measured the dose with practiced care, her lips moving in a silent count, and brought it to the Duchess's mouth with a gentleness that struck Thomas as far too tender for a girl who had spent the whole afternoon nursing a bruised wrist and saying nothing about it. "You tend to her every evening?" Thomas asked, watching Hannah set the bottle down. Hannah gave the faintest dip of her chin, not quite a nod, more an acknowledgement that she had heard him at all. "She does," Eleanor answered for her, settling deeper into her pillows. "Since my Robert passed, no one else will do. She sits with me through the worst of the nights, doesn't chatter at me the way the other girls do, just sits." Thomas pulled a chair close to the fire, watching Hannah's needle move through the lace, in and out, steady as a heartbeat. He thought of the parlour, the twisted wrist, the silence that had filled the room like water rising past a man's chin. "About this afternoon," he began carefully. "My uncle, has he troubled you before?" Hannah's needle paused mid-stitch. For a moment she said nothing, and Thomas thought she might simply continue her work as though he had not spoken at all. Then, slowly, she gave a single, small nod, eyes still fixed on the lace in her lap. "How long?" A pause. Then she held up 2 fingers, folded close against her palm, before returning them to her sewing. 2 years, then. Since before his father's death, Thomas felt something twist low in his chest, half anger, half something closer to shame, that he had been abroad in silk-lined drawing rooms while his own household turned this cruel beneath his very roof. "Why do you not speak of it? Report him to Wren, to the housekeeper, to anyone." Hannah's hands stilled entirely now. She lifted her head at last, and for the first time that evening her eyes met his directly. Not the tea brown he had noticed in the parlour, but something darker, more troubled, carrying a weight he could not name. She opened her mouth as though to answer. No sound came. Not a whisper, not a broken syllable, nothing at all. And in that silence Thomas understood, with a jolt that ran cold down his spine, that this was not defiance or fear keeping her tongue still. It was something else entirely. Something that had nothing to do with his uncle's cruelty and everything to do with whatever secret sat locked behind her closed lips. He leaned forward slightly, reaching to touch the edge of her sleeve where the bandage peeked from beneath the linen cuff, meaning only to ask whether the wound had been properly dressed. Before his fingers could brush the fabric, Lady Eleanor stirred in her sleep, her breathing catching on a half-formed sentence. "The vault," she muttered, her head turning restlessly against the pillow, eyes still closed, lost somewhere between waking and dream. Tell him of the vault and the Duke's true word. He must know before it's too late." The words trailed into a soft, uneven snore. Hannah went rigid. Thomas watched the colour drain from her face, watched her gaze snap toward the sleeping Duchess and then back to him, wide and sharp with something that looked, unmistakably, like fear. Not the guarded caution she had shown all evening. Real fear, sudden and total, as though the old woman's mumbled words had struck her like a physical blow. For one long moment, neither of them moved. The fire popped and settled in the grate. Rain lashed harder against the window pane. And in that suspended silence, Thomas felt certain that something vast and hidden had just brushed past them both in the dark. Close enough to touch, gone before either of them could grasp its shape. Then Hannah was on her feet, the lace shawl slipping unheeded from her lap to the floor. She dropped a hurried curtsy, eyes lowered once more, and was gone through the narrow servant's door before Thomas could rise from his chair, her quick footsteps fading into the cold stone passage beyond. He sat alone beside his sleeping grandmother for a long while afterward, the candle guttering low, turning her half-dreamed words over and over in his mind. The vault. The Duke's true word. His father had been dead 8 months, and somewhere in this house, it seemed, a silent servant girl was carrying a piece of him that no one else had been trusted to hear. Morning brought a hard frost and a clear sky, and Thomas was glad of both after 2 days shut up indoors with his uncle's cold civility and his grandmother's wandering mind. He rode out early, alone, his steward having pressed a leather satchel of tenancy ledgers into his hands the evening before, with the quiet suggestion that a new duke ought to know his own people before he tried to govern them. Oakhaven lay 3 miles south, tucked into a fold of the valley where the road forded a shallow stream before climbing again toward the church spire. Smoke curled from a dozen chimneys, and the smell of wood smoke and wet wool followed Thomas down the high street as he dismounted outside the Black Boar Inn, its sign creaking on rusted hinges. Inside, the low-beamed taproom was near empty at that hour, save for 2 farmhands nursing tankards by the fire and the innkeeper, a broad, red-faced man named Josiah Coote, polishing pewter behind the bar. "Your Grace." Coote straightened so fast he nearly dropped the mug in his hand. "We'd heard you were back. Didn't look for you down here so soon." "I mean to know my tenant's business as well as my own, Mr. Coote. My steward tells me half the parish owes rent, and the other half owes you for ale." Thomas set the satchel on the bar with a faint smile, trying to put the man at ease. "I've come to look at the accounts, if you'll permit it." Coote's easy manner faltered. He glanced toward the farmhands by the fire, lowered his voice, and busied himself pulling a heavy ledger from beneath the counter, as though he'd rather not be seen handing it over. "There's rent arrears here right enough, sir, same as any year. But there's somewhat else you ought to know, seeing as you're asking after accounts." He flipped the pages with thick fingers, stopping at a column of entries near the back. "Your uncle, Lord Richard, runs up debts something fearful when he comes through of an evening. Cards, mostly. Dice on a bad night." Thomas frowned. "That's hardly news to me." "Aye, but here's the strange part." Coote tapped the page. "Every one of those debts gets settled, regular as clockwork, within the month, and not by his lordship's own hand, neither." Thomas leaned over the ledger, and the innkeeper's blunt finger traced down a row of entries, dates and sums scrawled in a small, careful, looping script, quite unlike Richard's own heavy hand. "Someone from the manor pays it," Coote said. "Sends it down with the carrier, wrapped in paper, never a name attached save for initials. Been going on the better part of 2 years now." Something in the shape of those letters tugged at Thomas's memory, though he could not place why. He studied the neat copperplate a long moment, then thanked Coote, tucked the ledger's page reference into his own notes, and rode back toward the manor, with the frost still sharp on the hedgerows and a new unease settling over him like a second coat. It was 2 days later, going through the contents of his father's old estate room with the housekeeper, Mrs. Pruitt, that the memory surfaced whole. He had asked her to fetch an inventory of the late Duke's linen and effects, a tedious matter of cataloguing before any of it could be properly stored or given away. Mrs. Pruitt spread a stack of tags across the desk, each one tied by ribbon to a corresponding chest or wardrobe, each marked in the same careful, looping hand he had seen in Coote's ledger not 2 days past. "Who writes these tags, Mrs. Pruitt?" "Hannah does the linen inventories, Your Grace, same as she's done these 3 years. Neat hand, that girl. Wasted on scullery work if you ask me, though nobody did." The housekeeper gave a short laugh and moved on to the next drawer, entirely unaware of the way Thomas had gone very still beside her. He picked up one of the tags and held it beside the page he had copied from the innkeeper's ledger. The same slanted J, the same looped H, the same small, deliberate flourish beneath every capital letter, as though the hand that made it took pride in the shape of things even when no one was meant to notice. Hannah, a servant girl earning perhaps £10 a year, if that, quietly clearing his uncle's gambling debts down in the village, debts that ran, by Coote's own reckoning, well past what any housemaid's wages could cover in a decade, let alone 2 years. Thomas set the tag down slowly and thought of the small allowance his grandmother was known to press upon her favourites now and again, a shilling here, a few pence there, hardly noticed by a household grown careless under Richard's management. He thought of Hannah's bruised wrist, her locked silence, the strange, unshakable loyalty that kept her tending an old woman's fire each night, and mending torn lace by candlelight without a word of complaint. She was protecting them, not herself. Them, the family name, the estate's reputation in a village that would delight in nothing more than the scandal of a lord's unpaid debts dragged through every taproom for miles. But why would a servant girl spend everything she had, and risk her own safety besides, to shield a man who twisted her wrist black and blue behind closed doors? Thomas folded the tag carefully into his coat pocket, aware for the first time that whatever secret Hannah carried ran far deeper and older than a stolen brass key, and that his uncle, for all his bluster about theft, might be chasing the smaller half of a much larger truth. The silver went missing on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday morning Hannah stood accused of stealing it. Thomas learned of the matter only after it was already done. He had ridden out before dawn to see a tenant's failing roof repaired, and by the time he returned, mud-splattered and cold to the bone, Wren met him at the door with a face drawn tight and grey. "Your uncle has dismissed the girl Hannah, Your Grace. Sent her off not 2 hours past, under guard, bound for the workhouse at Chesterfield. He claims she took the dowager's silver spoons from the good cabinet." Thomas stood frozen in the entrance hall, still in his riding gloves, water dripping from the brim of his hat onto the flagstones. "On whose authority?" "His own, sir. He said the matter couldn't wait for you to be found, that theft from the family plate was cause enough for immediate dismissal, guard or no guard." Wren hesitated, wringing his hands. "I did try to send word, Your Grace, but the stable boy—" A commotion at the servants' entrance cut him short. A boy of perhaps 18 came skidding through the passage, cap askew, breathless from running. "Your Grace, begging your pardon, sir, but I saw where they've took her. The Chesterfield Road past the old mill, not 20 minutes gone. 2 of Lord Richard's footmen, walking her out like a common thief, and her not saying nothing the whole while, not one word." Thomas did not wait to hear the rest. He was already back through the door, shouting for his horse to be saddled again, ignoring Wren's protests that he had eaten nothing since morning, that the light was already failing, that a duke oughtn't chase after servants on muddy roads like some errand boy. He rode hard, the fog thickening as the day dimmed toward dusk, hedgerows looming pale and skeletal on either side of the turnpike road. His mount's breath came in great white clouds, hooves throwing up clods of frozen mud, and still there was no sign of the party ahead. He caught them at last near the toll gate outside Chesterfield, where the road narrowed between a stone wall and a deep ditch running with rainwater. A hired cart stood waiting, the horse stamping and miserable in the cold, and beside it, 2 footmen in Ashridge livery flanked a small, huddled figure wrapped in nothing more than a thin grey cloak entirely unsuited to the weather. Hannah did not look up when the cart driver called out at the sound of an approaching rider. She stood with her shoulders drawn in, arms wrapped tight around herself, staring at some fixed point on the ground, as though she had already resigned herself to whatever came next. "Stop there," Thomas called, reining his horse hard before the gate. "By whose order do you escort this woman?" The taller of the 2 footmen, a man Thomas half recognized from the stables, straightened uneasily. "Lord Richard's order, Your Grace. Theft of the family silver, discovered this morning in her possession." "Discovered how? By whom?" The footman's certainty wavered. I couldn't say exactly, sir. His lordship informed the housekeeper, and she instructed us to see the girl to the workhouse gate before nightfall, on account of the roads." Thomas dismounted, his boots striking the frozen mud with a hard, deliberate sound, and crossed to where Hannah stood. Up close, he could see her lips had gone pale with cold, her hands trembling where they gripped her own elbows, though whether from the chill or from fear he could not say. "Was anything found on your person?" he asked her directly. "Any spoon? Any piece of plate?" Hannah shook her head, once, firm and certain. "Was your room searched before this order was given, or after?" Another shake. "No search at all, then. Only an accusation, and a convenient excuse to be rid of a girl who knew far too much and said far too little." Thomas turned back to the footman, and his voice, when it came, carried the cold authority of a man who had spent 4 years learning exactly how to make lesser men step back from him. "I am Duke of Ashridge, and this household answers to me before it answers to my uncle. You will release this woman into my care at once, and you will return to the manor and inform Lord Richard that I wish to speak with him personally regarding this matter, tonight, without delay." The footman exchanged a look, weighing perhaps a moment's loyalty to Richard against the far greater danger of defying the man who now held every deed, every wage, every roof over their heads. It did not take them long to decide. They stepped back from the cart without another word, and the driver, sensing the shift, was already turning his horse before Thomas had finished speaking. He swung his cloak from his own shoulders and settled it around Hannah's, the thick wool swallowing her small frame entirely, and lifted her up before him onto his horse without asking whether she wished it, because he suspected, rightly, that she was too cold and too frightened to protest either way. They rode back through the thickening fog in silence, the manor's chimneys just visible as a smudge of grey against the darker grey of the sky. Hannah sat stiff against him at first, holding herself apart even as her teeth chattered, but somewhere past the old mill, worn down by cold and exhaustion and the slow release of fear, she let her head fall back against his chest. Thomas felt the change in her the way one feels a change in weather, subtle, then unmistakable. The wall she had kept between them since the parlour, since the sick room, since every silent evening in between, had not fallen entirely, but it had cracked, just enough, and through that crack he sensed, for the first time, the shape of the girl who lived beneath all that careful silence. He said nothing the rest of the ride home, and neither did she, but her hand, when at last it found the folds of his cloak to steady herself against a rough stretch of road, did not pull away again. After Chesterfield, Thomas could not, in good conscience, leave Hannah anywhere within his uncle's easy reach. He gave the matter careful thought over a sleepless night, and by morning he had settled on the old glass house at the far edge of the kitchen gardens, half forgotten since his mother's death, its citrus trees gone leggy and untended for want of a proper hand. "You'll answer to no one but the head gardener," he told Hannah, standing amid the frosted glass panes and the tangled remains of a passion vine. "And he answers only to me. My uncle has no cause to set foot here." Hannah looked about the glass house slowly, at the cracked pots and the warm, earthy air trapped beneath the glass, and something in her shoulders eased for the first time since Thomas had known her. She dropped a small curtsy, and though she said nothing, the gratitude in her face needed no words at all. He began visiting each afternoon. He told himself at first that it was a matter of oversight, of a duke checking that his instructions were properly followed. He brought his correspondence with him, a lap desk balanced on his knee, and sat on an overturned crate while Hannah worked among the citrus trees, pruning dead growth, coaxing new shoots toward the light, with a gentleness that seemed, to Thomas, entirely at odds with the guarded stillness she wore everywhere else in the house. Within a week, the pretense of correspondence had worn thin. He came simply to sit with her, and she, in her own quiet way, seemed to have made room for him among the citrus pots, without either of them ever remarking on it. It was Hannah who found the slate. A small board, meant for labeling seedlings and cuttings, chalk worn to a stub beside it. She held it out to him one grey afternoon, and when he looked puzzled, she mimed writing across her palm, then pointed to the board, then to herself. "I can write." Thomas took the slate and the chalk and, after a moment's thought, wrote a single question beneath the smudged remains of some gardener's old label. "Why do you not speak?" Hannah studied the words a long while. Then she took the chalk from his hand, wiped the slate clean with the edge of her apron, and wrote, in that same careful, looping script he had first seen in the innkeeper's ledger, "A promise, not a wound." It was not an answer, not truly, but it was more than she had given him in weeks, and Thomas found he was oddly moved by the small, deliberate honesty of it. Over the following afternoons, question by careful question, the slate filled and was wiped clean and filled again, and Thomas learned, in fragments, the shape of a girl he had until then known only through silence and bruises and a stranger's careful handwriting in a village ledger. She had come to Ashridge at 12, an orphan taken in through his father's own kindness. She had scrubbed pots before she ever touched linen, had taught herself letters from cast-off primers meant for the housekeeper's children, had sat with the old duke through the worst of his final illness, because no one else in the house had the patience for a dying man's long, rambling nights. "He trusted you," Thomas wrote one afternoon, watching her tend a small orange tree heavy with green, unripe fruit. Hannah paused, chalk hovering above the slate a long moment before she wrote her answer. "He trusted me with everything. I swore it on his deathbed. I would not break it, not for fear, not for cold, not for anything he could do to me." She had not written Richard's name, but she had not needed to. Thomas watched her set the chalk down, watched the faint tremor in her hand as she smoothed her apron, and felt the same cold certainty he had carried since the sick room settled deeper into his chest. Whatever she had sworn to protect, it was worth more to her than her own safety, worth more than 2 years of silent suffering under his uncle's cruelty. "Hannah." He set his own hand lightly over hers, where it rested on the potting bench, and for once she did not draw away. "Whatever it is, you need not carry it alone any longer. I am here now." She looked up at him then, and something passed between them in the warm, humid quiet of the glasshouse that neither slate nor chalk could have properly captured. A kind of understanding, fragile and new, forming slowly between two people who had each, in their own way, spent years learning to guard themselves against a world too quick to take advantage. She reached for the chalk once more, and this time her hand did not tremble as she wrote. "I swore it to your father, on the vault, on the family's true word." Before Thomas could ask what she meant, before he could press her further toward the answer that had haunted him since his grandmother's fevered mutterings weeks before, a shadow fell across the frosted glass of the doorway. Lord Richard stood at the entrance to the glasshouse, dressed for business rather than idle cruelty, a thin, sharp-faced man in black at his side whom Thomas recognized, with a sinking feeling, as a solicitor from Chesterfield. Richard held a folded paper in one gloved hand, and the look on his face carried none of the wariness he had shown in the parlour weeks before. It carried, instead, the cold satisfaction of a man who believed he finally held the upper hand. "Thomas," Richard said, stepping into the humid warmth of the glasshouse as though he owned every pane of glass above their heads. "How touching. I do hope I'm not interrupting anything improper." "State your business, uncle, or leave." Richard's gaze slid past him to Hannah, standing rigid beside the potting bench, the slate still clutched against her apron as though she might hide the chalked words from view. "My business," Richard said, unfolding the paper with a flourish, "is a warrant, duly signed, to search the girls' quarters in the attic dormitories. It seems there is rather more to this household's little mysteries than a missing key, wouldn't you agree? And I intend to find out precisely what." The attic dormitories sat beneath the eaves of the manor, a low, sloping row of rooms reached by a narrow back staircase the family rarely used. By the time Thomas caught up with his uncle and the solicitor, they had already climbed those stairs and thrown open the door to the small chamber Hannah shared with two other maids, and the sound of splitting straw and tearing ticking greeted him before he reached the top step. "This is unlawful," Thomas said, pushing past the solicitor into the cramped room. "A warrant, signed by whom, precisely? No magistrate in this county would grant such a thing on the word of a man chasing a housemaid over a lost key." The solicitor, a narrow, dry man named Mr. Fellows, cleared his throat and made a show of consulting the paper in his hand, though his eyes would not quite meet Thomas's own. "The warrant concerns matters somewhat larger than a key, Your Grace. Lord Richard has laid before me evidence suggesting the girl conspired with your late father to alter the terms of succession and to conceal certain estate funds from their rightful evidence." Thomas's voice cut through the small room like a blade. "What evidence?" Richard, kneeling beside the narrow straw mattress with his sleeves pushed back, did not look up from his work. He had already torn one long seam open, scattering straw across the bare floorboards, and now he thrust his hand deep into the ticking, searching with the grim determination of a man who had convinced himself the truth lay only an arm's length away. "The debts, Thomas. The village ledgers you were so clever to discover. A servant girl paying 2 years of a lord's gambling losses from a wage that wouldn't cover the interest, let alone the sum itself. Where does such money come from, if not from funds she took from my brother's desk before he died? Funds meant, perhaps, to buy her silence about something rather worse than a stolen spoon." Behind him, Hannah stood pressed against the doorframe, her arms wrapped tight around herself, watching her small world reduced to torn straw and scattered belongings without a word of protest. Thomas saw her jaw tighten, saw the effort it cost her to remain silent while a stranger's hands rifled through the few possessions she owned in the world. A cracked hand mirror, a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon, a small wooden box that Richard now seized upon with visible triumph. He wrenched the lid open. Inside lay nothing more than a lock of dark hair tied with thread, and a folded scrap of paper gone soft with handling. Richard unfolded it with rough, careless fingers. Thomas stepped forward and placed himself directly between his uncle and the girl, close enough that Richard would have to move him bodily aside to reach her again. "You will not touch her," he said quietly. "Not her belongings, not her person, not one hair on her head. Whatever quarrel you have with the succession, whatever debts you owe half the county, you will settle them with me, and me alone." Richard straightened slowly, the scrap of paper still in his hand, his face carrying the particular fury of a man who felt the ground shifting beneath feet he had always believed stood on solid stone. "You defend her rather warmly for a duke who's known the girl scarcely a month." "I defend what is right. You would do well to remember there is a difference." Whatever answer Richard meant to give was lost in the sudden commotion on the stairs below. Hurried footsteps, the housekeeper Mrs. Pruitt's voice raised in alarm, and then the Dowager Duchess herself appearing in the doorway on the housekeeper's arm, her white hair unbound, a shawl thrown hastily over her nightgown, her pale eyes wide and unfocused in the lamplight. "What is this noise?" Eleanor's voice trembled, thin and confused, casting about the ruined room as though she could not quite reconcile what she saw with any world she understood. "Robert? Is that you, Robert? Why have they torn apart the linen so?" "Grandmother, you oughtn't be out of bed," Thomas began, moving toward her, but she brushed past him with a strength that startled everyone in the room, her gaze fixing at last on Hannah, still pressed against the doorframe with tears standing unshed in her eyes. Eleanor crossed the small space and took Hannah's face between her trembling hands, and her voice, when it came, carried a sudden clarity that cut through the fog of her failing mind like a blade through mist. "You must not let them frighten you. You are the guardian of the bloodline. My son chose you himself, and no man in this house has the right to touch what he entrusted to your keeping." She turned then, fierce and trembling, to face Richard directly, her finger raised with all the authority of a duchess who had once ruled this house absolutely. "Leave her be, Richard. Leave her be, or I shall see you disinherited before the week is out. Mark me." The room fell utterly silent. Richard's face had gone very pale, his eyes fixed on his mother with an expression Thomas could not quite name. Shock, certainly, but beneath it, something closer to fear, as though the old woman's confused mind had just laid bare a truth he had spent years trying desperately to keep buried. Guardian of the bloodline. Thomas looked from his grandmother's fierce, trembling face to Hannah's, pale and stricken in the lamplight, and felt the last of his careful assumptions crumble away entirely. This was no matter of a missing key, no petty theft dressed up as scandal. Whatever secret Hannah carried, it reached back into the very foundations of his family's name, and his grandmother, frail, forgetful, dismissed by every physician in London as beyond reliable memory, had just spoken the one truth that no one in that room, save Hannah herself, had dared to say aloud. Ashridge was no longer safe, and Thomas knew it the moment his grandmother's words settled into the ruined little room above the eaves. Whatever secret Hannah carried, his uncle now believed it worth tearing straw mattresses apart to find, worth forged warrants and false accusations, worth risking his own mother's fragile trust to unearth. A house that unsettled could not be trusted to hold either of them safely another week. He gave the order that same night. Trunks were packed before dawn, the London townhouse roused by messenger to have rooms readied, and by the time the sun had properly cleared the eastern hills, Thomas, his grandmother, and Hannah were rattling south in the family carriage, the manor's grey chimneys shrinking behind them into the mist. London closed around them 2 days later in a haze of coal smoke and gaslight, the streets of High Holborn thick with hansom cabs and street criers, even as evening settled over the Thames. The townhouse, when they reached it, seemed a different world entirely from Ashridge's cold stone corridors, warm, gaslit rooms, thick Turkish carpets muffling every footstep, a household staff too well trained and too well paid to trouble themselves with a servant girl's silence. Eleanor, exhausted by the journey, was settled into her rooms with her own maid and a doctor summoned from Harley Street, and for the first time in weeks, Thomas felt the tight coil of worry in his chest ease, if only slightly. Whatever Richard intended next, he would need considerably more nerve to attempt it beneath the gaze of London society than he had shown skulking about his own family's attics. It was Hannah who seemed, if anything, more unsettled by the change. Thomas found her the following afternoon, standing at the drawing-room window, watching the fog roll thick and yellow off the river, her hands twisted together before her in a way that suggested the city's noise and crowds pressed on her far heavier than the quiet countryside ever had. "You look as though London itself might swallow you whole," he said, coming to stand beside her. Hannah offered the smallest ghost of a smile and shook her head, though her eyes did not leave the window. "Come," Thomas said. "The garden behind the house is small, but it's quiet enough, and the air is better than anything you'll find on the street." The townhouse garden was little more than a walled square of gravel paths and clipped box hedges, wedged between the mews and the neighbouring residents, but after the crowded streets it felt almost like sanctuary. Hannah walked beside him in silence, her boots crunching softly over the frost-hardened gravel, and Thomas found himself, not for the first time, entirely content simply to walk without a word passing between them. "I ought to have thought of this sooner," he said eventually, drawing a length of pale silk from beneath his coat, a scarf he had purchased that very morning from a shop on Bond Street, on impulse, telling himself at the time it was nothing more than practical concern for the London chill. "The wind here cuts sharper than at Ashridge. You'll want your throat covered, or you'll catch your death before winter's properly begun." He draped it carefully about her shoulders, and Hannah's fingers rose to touch the fine fabric with an expression of such quiet astonishment that Thomas felt a small, foolish satisfaction at having thought to bring it at all. "I mean what I say to you now, Hannah, and I want you to understand it fully," he continued, more serious. "Whatever secret you carry, whatever oath binds your tongue, I will not press you further than you're willing to give. You have my word that no harm will come to you under this roof, or any roof of mine, regardless of what truth you're protecting, or how long you choose to protect it." She turned to face him fully then, the fog curling pale about them both in the gaslit dusk, and for a long moment she said nothing at all, only studied his face with an intensity that made him wonder what exactly she searched for there. Then, slowly, she reached out and took his hand. It was such a small gesture, her bare fingers closing gently around his own gloved hand, her grip light but sure, and yet Thomas felt it more keenly than he had felt anything in years of careful diplomatic handshakes and formal courtesies abroad. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her eyes, fixed on his with a tenderness that had not been there in the parlour, nor the sick room, nor even the warm quiet of the glass-house, said everything her voice could not. Trust, freely given at last, after weeks of guarded silence. Something more than trust, if he read her rightly, though neither of them was yet ready to name it aloud. "Hannah," he said softly, covering her hand with his other one. "Whatever this oath is, whatever you swore to my father, I begin to think it has cost you a great deal more than any of us have understood. When you are ready to set that burden down, I will be here to help you carry it. Until then, I ask nothing of you but this, that you trust I mean every word I have said." She nodded, slow and certain, and for the first time since Thomas had returned to England, he saw something in her face that was not fear, nor grief, nor careful watchfulness, but something closer to hope. They stood together a while longer in the fog-wrapped garden, hands joined, neither speaking, while somewhere beyond the high brick walls London rumbled on with its cabs and its crowds and its thousand small, indifferent lives, entirely unaware that in one quiet corner of the city, a silent vow 4 years in the keeping had just begun, very slowly, to loosen its grip. Chancery Lane smelled of dust and old parchment, of tallow candles burned down to stubs over decades of late-night conveyancing, and Thomas found the atmosphere suited his mood entirely as he climbed the narrow stairs to the offices of Ponsonby and Hale, solicitors to the Dukes of Ashridge for the better part of a century. Mr. Ponsonby himself was a stooped, silver-haired man with ink-stained fingers and the careful, unhurried manner of someone who had spent a lifetime discovering that haste rarely served the truth. He rose from behind a desk buried under stacks of bound ledgers and rolled deeds, extending a dry hand in greeting. "Your Grace, I confess I had hoped to see you sooner. Given the state of affairs, I understand your uncle has been stirring at Ashridge." "Then you've already heard something of it." Thomas took the offered chair, setting his hat on his knee. "I'll be plain with you, Mr. Ponsonby. I need to understand exactly what standing my uncle has, or believes he has, over this dukedom's finances, and whether there's any truth to be found in his claims." Ponsonby settled back into his own chair with a small sigh, and drew a particular ledger from the pile before him, its leather binding cracked and softened with age. "Your late father, Your Grace, left instructions that were, in certain respects, unusual. Instructions concerning the original land deeds and the family's most significant holdings. Instructions that required a personal signet key, one he kept always upon his own person, to unlock the vault in which the true deeds are held." The vault. Thomas felt the words settle into place with a quiet, cold certainty, echoing his grandmother's fevered mutterings, echoing the words chalked across Hannah's slate in the warm hush of the glass-house. My grandmother spoke of it, my father's true word. Then perhaps you understand already more than I credited you. Ponsonby folded his ink-stained hands atop the ledger. Without that key, Your Grace, the deeds cannot be produced, and without the deeds, certain provisions in your father's will cannot presently be enforced. Provisions that would otherwise bar your uncle absolutely from any claim over the estate's management. And in their absence? In their absence, and given your own long residence abroad these 4 years, Lord Richard retains grounds to argue temporary guardianship of the dukedom's finances before the courts, on the reasoning that the estate cannot be left unmanaged while its rightful heir proves himself unreachable or unfit to assume full control. It is a thin argument, Your Grace, but not without some legal weight, particularly before a judge unfamiliar with the family's true circumstances. Thomas sat back, turning the shape of it over in his mind. A missing key, a vault sealed against the very deeds that would strip his uncle of all power. A servant girl who had sworn, on a dying man's word, to guard something she called the family's true word, and who had spent 2 years of her own meager wages quietly protecting the very man now trying to steal what she guarded. It made a terrible, elegant sense. "There is more you should know," Ponsonby continued, drawing a second folder from beneath the ledger, this one thinner, its pages covered in columns of figures. "I took the liberty of reviewing the estate's timber accounts upon hearing of Lord Richard's activities. He has been in correspondence these past months with 2 separate merchants in Nottingham regarding the sale of standing timber across the northern boundary of the estate, a considerable tract, Your Grace, and one your father expressly forbade from ever being felled or sold in his own lifetime. To cover his debts?" "I would assume so, given the sums discussed and the sums Mr. Coote's ledger appears to record him owing." Ponsonby closed the folder gently. "He has not yet the authority to complete such a sale, but should the courts grant him even temporary guardianship of the estate's finances, that authority would follow within weeks, and half your northern woodland could be gone before the matter of the vault is ever properly resolved." Thomas rose from his chair and crossed to the tall window overlooking the lane below, where clerks hurried between chambers under a grey London sky, entirely unaware of the fortunes being decided in the rooms above their heads. He thought of his father, dying slowly through a long winter, trusting no lawyer, no brother, no wife left living, with the true weight of the family's most guarded secret, trusting it instead to a serving girl of 16 who had sat with him through his worst nights because no one else had the patience to stay. It struck him, standing there, as either the strangest decision a dying duke had ever made, or the wisest one, and he found himself unable yet to decide which. "What would you have me do, Mr. Ponsonby?" he asked at last, turning back from the window. "I could contest my uncle's claim through every court in London, drag this matter out for years, ruin him with his own debts laid bare before every judge in the kingdom, if that's what the law allows." "It is allowed, Your Grace. Whether it is wise is another matter entirely." Thomas considered this a long moment, weighing the cold satisfaction such a course might bring against the slower, harder work of simply proving himself worthy of the name he carried. "No," he said finally, and felt something settle into place as he spoke it aloud. "I'll not fight him with tricks and delays and every underhanded means the law permits, however tempting. Ashridge deserves better than a duke who wins his own house back through spite. I mean to protect the estate, protect my grandmother, protect Hannah, and I mean to do it honourably, as my father would have done, whatever the cost in time or trouble." Ponsonby studied him a moment, something like quiet approval crossing his lined face. "Your father would have said much the same, Your Grace, if I may say so. It is, perhaps, why he trusted this particular secret to a girl who understood loyalty better than most men of rank ever learn it." Thomas said nothing to that, only nodded, and gathered his hat to leave, carrying with him now not only the shape of his uncle's scheme, but a fuller, heavier sense of exactly what, and whom, he meant to protect before this matter found its end. The invitation arrived 3 days later, embossed and gilt-edged, from Lord Danby's townhouse in Mayfair, a card Thomas would ordinarily have set aside without much thought, save that his uncle's name appeared beneath his own on the guest list, added, Ponsonby's clerk later confirmed, at Richard's own particular request. "He means to make a scene of it," Thomas said, turning the card over in his fingers as he sat with Ponsonby that evening. "Why else would he trouble himself to be seen at a ball he'd otherwise avoid, and insist on standing beside my own name on the invitation? Then perhaps, Your Grace, the wisest course is not to give him the empty room he hopes to find you absent from." Thomas arrived at Lord Danby's ballroom 3 nights later, beneath a sky of hard, cold stars, the townhouse ablaze with candlelight spilling from every tall window onto the wet pavement below. Inside, chandeliers dripped crystal light across a floor crowded with silk gowns and tailcoats, a string quartet sawing away beneath the hum of 100 overlapping conversations. He had scarcely handed his card to the footman before he felt the shift in the room, heads turning, fans lifting to whisper behind, a ripple of attention following him across the marble floor that had nothing to do with ordinary curiosity toward a duke newly returned from the continent. He found the source of it within the quarter hour, cornered by Lady Fenwick near the refreshment table, her painted smile sharp as a blade beneath its polite curve. "Your Grace, how good to see you looking so well, given all the talk. We had heard the strangest rumour that you've taken quite a particular interest in a servant girl up at Ashridge. A mute creature, they say, caught stealing the family silver, and yet somehow still kept beneath your own roof rather than turned out. Rumours travel a great distance for so little truth in them, Lady Fenwick." "Do they? Your uncle seemed rather certain of the details when he spoke of it not an hour past." Her eyes glittered with unmistakable relish. "He says the girl has bewitched you entirely, that you defend a common thief against your own family's interests, that she's stolen rather more than spoons from beneath that roof." Thomas felt the old, familiar calm settle over him, the same steadiness that had carried him through 4 years of diplomatic snares far more dangerous than a scheming uncle and a room full of idle gossips. "Then allow me to correct whatever version has reached your ears," he said, raising his voice just enough that those nearby might overhear without appearing to strain for it. "The young woman in question is Hannah, formerly of Ashridge's household staff, presently under my protection following an unlawful attempt by my uncle to have her dismissed on a false charge, without proof, without a proper search, and without any authority save his own convenience." A hush rippled outward from their small circle, spreading through the nearest knots of guests with the particular speed of scandal sensing fresh blood. "She is not a thief," Thomas continued, steady and clear. "She is a woman of considerable character, who has endured cruelty in that household for years. Cruelty I mean to see answered for, and I will not stand in this room or any other and allow her name to be dragged through gossip by a man too ashamed of his own gambling debts to face them honestly." Across the ballroom, Thomas saw his uncle turn from a cluster of gentlemen near the card-room, his face draining of colour as the murmur of the crowd carried Thomas's words toward him. Richard crossed the floor with quick, furious strides, the polished veneer of his public manner cracking with every step. "You disgrace this family, Thomas, defending a servant's reputation before half of London society, as though her honour were worth more than your own name." "Her honour," Thomas said, loud enough now that the quartet itself faltered mid-phrase, "is worth considerably more than yours, uncle, given what I've learned these past weeks of exactly how you've spent this family's money and this family's trust." The room had gone properly silent now, every guest within 20 feet arrested mid-conversation, fans stilled, glasses paused halfway to lips, the whole glittering assembly holding its breath for whatever came next. Richard's hand trembled as he drew a folded paper from inside his coat, and Thomas recognized, with a sinking certainty, the particular quality of official stamps and formal seals even before his uncle unfolded it fully. "Then let all of London witness this as well." Richard's voice carried a note of triumph beneath its fury. "A summons, granted this very afternoon, freezing the dukedom's accounts pending a full inquiry into the estate's management during your absence abroad. You may defend a servant's honour all you like, nephew, but you'll find it a good deal harder to defend an estate with not a shilling of its own money left to spend." A gasp rippled through the nearest guests, followed by the low, eager murmur of a scandal finding new and richer ground to feed upon. Thomas took the paper from his uncle's hand and studied it a long moment, the neat legal script confirming exactly what Richard claimed. It was a serious blow, sharper and better timed than he had anticipated, delivered in the one setting calculated to cause the most public damage. But he found, standing there beneath Lord Danby's blazing chandeliers, with every eye in the room fixed upon him, that he felt no despair at all, only a cold, clarifying purpose. "Then I shall resolve it," he said simply, folding the summons and tucking it inside his own coat. "The same way I intend to resolve everything else you've set against me, uncle. Not here, and not through spectacle. He turned without another word, ignoring the ripple of astonished whispers following him across the marble floor, and made directly for the door, already calling for his carriage before he'd reached the entrance hall. Whatever answer lay behind his father's vault, however small the window of time remaining to find it, he understood now that London held no further use for him. The truth, and Hannah, and whatever remained of his family's fortune, all waited 3 days north, back where this had begun. They reached Ashridge past midnight, the carriage lamps throwing weak pools of light across a drive gone silent and empty, the manor's windows dark save for a single candle burning in the housekeeper's rooms. Thomas had sent word ahead to have the household roused as little as possible, wanting no audience, no whispered speculation trailing them through the corridors before he had answers of his own. Hannah had said almost nothing on the journey north, her hands folded tight in her lap, her eyes fixed on the passing hedgerows as though she could already feel the weight of what waited for her at the end of the road. Thomas had not pressed her. He understood, by now, that whatever came next would come at her own pace, in her own time, and no amount of urgency on his part would hasten a vow 4 years in the keeping. The library received them in familiar darkness, the mahogany shelves rising to the shadowed ceiling, the smell of old paper and beeswax candles settling over Thomas like a memory of past evenings spent at his father's knee. He lit the candles himself, rather than wake a servant, and their small flames threw long, trembling shadows across the late Duke's massive desk, untouched, it seemed, since the day of his death. Hannah stood just inside the doorway, her cloak still fastened at her throat, watching him with an expression Thomas could not fully read, something between dread and a strange, fragile hope, as though she had carried this moment so long in imagination that its arrival left her uncertain how to stand within it. "Hannah." Thomas set the candle down and crossed to where she stood. "I did not bring you here to demand what you've guarded so long. I want you to understand that plainly, before anything else passes between us tonight." She looked up at him, uncertain, and he continued before she could question it further. "Whatever this vault holds, whatever truth my father entrusted to you rather than to any of us, I mean to protect this family and these people with or without it. I will fight my uncle through every court in England if I must, rebuild what's been broken with my own hands if I must, and I will do it whether you give me that key tonight or carry your oath to your grave. You are free of it, Hannah, free of the burden, whatever choice you make." For a long moment, Hannah said nothing at all, and Thomas thought, with a small ache of disappointment he had not expected to feel so sharply, that perhaps she meant to keep her silence even now, even here, even after everything. Then something shifted in her face, not fear, not the guarded stillness he had grown so used to reading in her, but something closer to wonder, as though his willingness to release her from the vow had accomplished what 4 years of threats and cruelty from his uncle had failed entirely to achieve. She reached beneath the collar of her gown, fingers working at the hidden lining of her bodice where a small pocket had been sewn, invisible to any eye that did not know precisely where to look, and drew out a small brass key on a length of worn ribbon, warmed from years against her skin. She crossed the space between them and placed it in his palm, her fingers lingering a moment against his own. And then, for the first time in 5 years, Hannah spoke. Her voice, when it came, was soft and uneven at first, rusted from disuse, but it steadied as she found her way back into the shape of speech, and Thomas felt the sound of it settle over him like something sacred. "Your father knew you would return to be the man he believed in," she said, and though her voice trembled, each word came clear and certain, carrying the weight of 4 years spent guarding it in silence. "He told me, near the end, that a duke who had to be watched every hour was no duke worth the name, and that his son had it in him to prove otherwise, given time and trial enough. He asked me to hold the key until I saw the truth of that with my own eyes, until I saw a man willing to lay down every claim to it rather than demand it as his due." Thomas felt his own throat tighten, the weight of his father's trust in this quiet, extraordinary woman settling over him in full for the first time. "He chose you," he said, "over solicitors, over family, over every soul in this house who might have claimed a right to such trust. He chose me because I had nothing to gain from betraying it, and nothing left to lose in keeping it, Hannah said, her voice growing steadier with every word, as though speech itself were a muscle remembering, slowly, how to move. I swore I would give it to no one, not your uncle, not the courts, not even you, until I was certain the promise would be kept in the spirit he intended and not merely the letter of it. And now? Now I am certain. She looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears and something warmer besides. You proved it tonight, asking nothing of me before you had already given everything. Thomas closed his hand around the small brass key, its edges worn smooth from years pressed against her skin, and felt the full shape of the secret at last resting solid and real in his palm. Whatever the vault held, whatever truth had waited 5 years for this precise moment to surface, he understood now that the greater treasure had already revealed itself in the quiet library around them, a promise honored against every cruelty meant to break it, and a woman who had risked everything she had, again and again, rather than see it fail. He turned toward the hidden panel behind the fireplace, the key catching candlelight as he raised it, and beside him, for the first time entirely unguarded, Hannah reached for his free hand and held it fast, ready, at last, to see the truth through to its end, together. The key turned with a soft, reluctant click, and the panel behind the fireplace swung inward on hinges that had not moved in 5 years, releasing a breath of cold, dry air that smelled faintly of old cedar and sealed paper. Thomas lifted the candle high and reached into the narrow cavity, his fingers closing first around a thick bundle of documents tied with ribbon gone brittle with age, and beneath it, a single sealed letter, his father's own hand unmistakable across the front. To my son, upon his true return. He carried both to the desk, Hannah close beside him, and broke the seal with hands that were not quite steady. The documents proved to be the original deeds to Ashridge and its outlying lands, whole and unblemished, exactly as Ponsonby had described them, the deeds that would, at last, allow Thomas to strip his uncle of any claim, however thin, to the estate's management. But it was the letter beneath them that held Thomas longest, his father's familiar, careful script filling 3 close-written pages. The old Duke had known, it seemed, far more of his brother's failings than anyone at Ashridge had ever suspected. He wrote plainly of debts discovered years before, of monies quietly diverted from tenant rents, of a pattern of cruelty toward the household staff that had finally convinced him, in his final months, that Richard could never be trusted with the smallest fraction of the family's well-being, let alone its full inheritance. The letter closed with a formal disinheritance, sealed and witnessed, stripping Richard of any claim to Ashridge's title, land or fortune, present or future, entire. Thomas read it twice through in silence, and when he looked up at last, he found Hannah watching him with quiet, steady eyes, as though she had known all along exactly what those pages held and had simply waited, all these years, for the right hands to open them. He knew, Thomas said softly, long before I returned. He knew what Richard was, and he trusted you to see justice done properly, in its own time, rather than let vengeance rush ahead of truth. He wanted you to lead with your own conscience, Hannah said, not with his old grievances laid ready-made before you. He thought a man ought to earn the right to judge, even his own family, rather than simply inherit the verdict. Richard was gone from Ashridge within the fortnight, the disinheritance letter presented before the same Chesterfield magistrate who had so carelessly granted his warrant weeks before, the deeds themselves silencing every argument his solicitor might otherwise have raised. He left under threat of prosecution should he ever again set foot upon the estate's grounds, his townhouse creditors and his ruined reputation trailing after him toward whatever corner of the country would still receive a man of his particular history. Thomas did not watch him go. He had, by then, considerably more pressing matters to attend to. He called the entire household staff and the greater part of the local tenancy to the great hall on a crisp winter afternoon, the old room filled for the first time in years with proper light streaming through the tall, leaded windows, snow lying thick and clean across the grounds beyond. Wren stood near the great hearth, visibly moved, while Mrs. Pruitt and the kitchen staff crowded close behind the assembled tenants, farmers in their good coats standing shoulder to shoulder with housemaids and stable hands, all of them watching the new Duke with a mixture of curiosity and cautious hope. Thomas spoke plainly, without ceremony. He announced the restoration of fair wages across every position in the household, wages that had quietly shrunk under Richard's mismanagement, even as the man's own debts had grown fat and reckless. He announced the settlement of every outstanding village debt racked up in the family's name, freeing tenants and shopkeepers alike from arrangements they had never asked to bear. He spoke of a new steward to oversee the estate's finances properly, of repairs long overdue on tenant roofs and fences, of a household that would, from that day forward, be run with honesty rather than fear. The great hall rang with applause and murmured approval, and Thomas felt, standing before them all, a satisfaction deeper than any diplomatic triumph he had known abroad. The particular, hard-won satisfaction of a man finally worthy of the roof over his own head. When the applause had settled, he stepped down from the raised dais at the head of the hall and crossed the flagstones to where Hannah stood near the edge of the crowd, dressed simply as ever, her chestnut hair neatly pinned beneath a plain cap, watching him approach with the same steady, quiet gaze that had first arrested his attention weeks before in a cold, unwelcoming parlour. The hall fell silent around them, every eye following the Duke as he took her hand before the entire assembled household. 5 years ago, Thomas said, his voice carrying easily now through the hushed hall, my father entrusted the truest word of this family to a servant girl of 16, because he trusted her character above every claim of birth or rank in this room. I have come to understand, these past weeks, exactly why he chose so well. He turned fully to face her, holding her hand steady in both of his own. Hannah, I do not ask you to stand beside me today as a maid of this house. I ask you to stand beside me as its Duchess, if you will have me, and to share whatever legacy remains to be built here, together, for as long as we both shall live. Hannah's eyes filled, though her voice, when it came, carried none of the fear or hesitation that had once kept her silent through years of cruelty and careful watching. It was clear and bright and entirely her own. I will, she said, and the great hall erupted into warm, genuine celebration, snow falling soft and silent beyond the tall windows as the long shadow of the past finally lifted from Ashridge Manor, leaving only the bright, uncertain promise of everything still to come.